The session had been running for 3 hours and 14 minutes and the word humanity had not been spoken once. This was not unusual. In the 4 decades since Earth had been admitted to the Galactic Council as a Class 3 member, the subject of humanity had come up in formal session approximately 11 times. Claire Holt knew this because she had read every session transcript going back to the day of Earth's admission, all 40 years of them in the first 3 months after taking her posting. She had a very good memory and a very organized mind, and she had decided early in her tenure that understanding exactly how invisible humanity was to this institution was more useful than pretending otherwise. 11 times in 40 years. She had counted. The chamber itself was impressive in the way that things built by committees of powerful species over long periods of time tend to be impressive, which was to say it was large and formal and filled with the kind of carefully designed gravitas that powerful institutions use to remind everyone present of the seriousness of the proceedings. 9 elevated platforms arranged in a curve, each one sized and positioned for the physical requirements of the species that occupied it. Lighting calibrated for 9 different visual spectra simultaneously. Translation systems so seamlessly integrated that you could watch a member of the Felian species, whose natural communication involved both sound and bioluminescent patterns, be perfectly understood by a Vorkan whose sensory apparatus registered neither bioluminescence nor half the sound frequencies the Felians used. It was, by any honest assessment, a remarkable piece of institutional engineering. At the far end of the chamber, set slightly apart from the main curve in a position that a diplomatic historian had once described in a published paper as technically present but architecturally marginal, was a single smaller platform. No elevation. A flat desk, a standard chair, a terminal with read-only access to the session record. The seat of Earth's non-voting representative, Class 3 membership, admitted 40 years ago. Claire Holt had been sitting in that seat for 4 years. She was 38 years old, which by human standards put her in the early middle portion of a career, and she had the kind of face that tended toward neutral and professional settings not because she lacked opinions but because she had learned early that in rooms where you were not being watched carefully, neutral was more useful than expressive. She dressed conservatively. She brought a physical notebook to every session, which several council staff members had remarked on over the years as charmingly old-fashioned, and she wrote in it regularly in a small precise handwriting that nobody had ever been close enough to read. She had accepted this posting when most of her colleagues considered it a diplomatic dead end. The previous 3 humans to hold the position had each served their minimum term, filed their reports, and moved on to more professionally rewarding assignments. The position offered no voting rights, no meaningful access to council deliberations outside of formal sessions, and a level of institutional influence roughly equivalent to being a well-informed observer who was occasionally allowed to make statements that nobody was required to respond to. Claire had requested the posting specifically. Her supervisor at the time had asked her why, and she had given an answer that was honest but incomplete, which was that she wanted to understand how the council actually functioned from the inside. The complete answer was longer and she had kept it to herself. The session continued around her. The 9 species at the main table were working through an agenda that covered territorial boundary adjustments in the outer sectors, resource extraction licensing in 3 disputed systems, and a proposal from the Vorkan delegation regarding updated military presence protocols along the Council's eastern boundary. These were the kinds of items that filled most Council sessions. The practical management of a galaxy-spanning institution with competing interests and finite resources and 3,000 years of accumulated precedents that shaped every new decision whether anyone acknowledged them or not. Senior Intelligence Officer Admiral Grath occupied the Vorkan platform with the settled authority of someone who had been the most formidable presence in every professional context he had entered for 3 decades. He was large even by Vorkan standards, his dark ridged plating the deep layered color that developed with significant age, his movements carrying the particular economy of someone who had never needed to use more effort than a situation required and had developed that quality so completely it was now simply how he existed. He had held his intelligence position through 4 council administrative cycles, which was an unusual degree of tenure that spoke to both his competence and his political instincts. Grath did not look at Claire's platform. He had not looked at it in any of the 12 sessions she had attended since he rotated onto the active council roster 8 months ago. This was not personal. He simply did not look at things that did not require his attention, and nothing at Claire's platform had ever required his attention. The routine agenda review reached its standard item near the end, the periodic check on whether any member species files in the intelligence division required updated threat assessments or capability reviews. It was a housekeeping item, the kind that existed because institutions required regular processes to function and because occasional reviews were better than no reviews even if most of them produced nothing actionable. The junior member who raised it was a Sethian, young for a council representative, thorough in the way that newer members often were before the institution's rhythms taught them which thoroughness was necessary and which was habit. Graff looked at his records with the efficiency of someone who already knew what they contained. His eyes moved down the list of species files. The major powers needed no comment. Several mid-tier species had ongoing assessments that he summarized briefly. When he reached the lower portion of the list, the Class 3 and Class 4 members, his pace did not change but his engagement did in the subtle way that engagement changes when you are moving through territory you have already fully mapped and are simply confirming the map is still accurate. The humanity file was near the bottom. He had last opened it personally about 8 years ago and had found nothing that required his attention. His staff had flagged it once in the intervening period for a routine update recommendation and he had approved the recommendation and the update had been assigned to a junior analyst and he could not currently recall whether it had been completed. Humanity, the Sethian said, moving through the list methodically. Any update required? Graff looked at the file entry. Last substantive update. Fleet registry. Trade activity. Territorial status. All of it consistent with everything he had known about humanity since before this species had a seat in the chamber. They build small ships and trade minerals, he said. His tone carried no particular weight because the subject required none. They are not relevant. The Sethian made a note and moved to the next item. Graff was already thinking about the eastern boundary proposal, which was the actual item of substance remaining on the agenda and which was going to require careful management of two competing Vorkan and Felian interests that had been building toward this particular disagreement for about 14 months. Humanity left his attention as completely and as quickly as it had entered it. At the far end of the chamber Claire Holt had been watching Graff since the agenda review began. She watched him reach her species in the list and she watched his expression not change in any meaningful way and she watched him deliver his 11 words with the specific casual certainty of someone who had no reason to believe the ground beneath a judgment was anything other than solid. She turned to her notebook. She wrote 2 words. Then she closed the notebook and placed her pen beside it and folded her hands on the desk and returned her attention to the session in the way she always returned her attention to the session, which was complete and quiet and entirely undetectable as the kind of attention it actually was. 3,000 light-years away, in a region of space that did not appear on any council jurisdictional map, 240 ships that did not appear on any council sensor array continued doing what they had been doing for 2 years. Waiting. The region had no official name because no official body had ever claimed it. 4 jurisdictional boundaries met at its edges, one from each of the 4 nearest council members, and the overlap created a legal condition that the council's territorial framework had never been designed to resolve cleanly. The standard procedure for such regions was a joint administration agreement between the relevant parties, but joint administration agreements required all parties to consider the region worth administering, and this particular region contained no significant resources, no habitable worlds, no strategic positioning that any of the 4 bordering members had ever found worth the political effort of negotiating over. It sat in the charts as a blank space with a footnote. Ray Garrett had found it 29 years ago and spent 3 weeks verifying what he had suspected from the first survey, which was that the jurisdictional overlap meant no single council authority had the standing to conduct enforcement operations there without triggering a procedural dispute with the other 3. It was, in the specific technical sense that mattered for his purposes, the most legally invisible piece of space within a reasonable construction distance from human territory. He had submitted his recommendation to the Project Leadership Board in a report that was 42 pages long and classified at a level that fewer than 60 people in human space had clearance to access. The board had approved it in 11 days, which for a decision of that scale was essentially immediate. That had been 29 years ago. Ray had been 34 years old, recently promoted to chief engineer on a project he had not yet been fully briefed on, brought in because of his work on deep space construction methodology and his specific research into material behavior at the boundary conditions where conventional physics started producing results that the standard models described as anomalous and that Ray had spent 6 years treating as data rather than noise. He was 63 now and the work had done to him what long serious work does to people who give themselves to it completely. His hands showed the accumulated record of 2 decades of physical engineering in environments that were not designed around human ergonomics. His hair had gone gray in his early 50s in a process so gradual he had not noticed until a colleague mentioned it, and by that point he had been too deep in a construction phase to think about it for more than a moment. The lines in his face were the lines of someone who had spent years making difficult decisions in conditions where the margin for error was small and the consequences of error were large. He did not look like someone who had spent his career on a comfortable project with adequate resources and reasonable timelines. He looked exactly like what he was. He was standing on the observation deck of the flagship when the morning shift began, which was where he often stood at the start of a day, not because the view provided anything he had not seen thousands of times but because the view was something he was not willing to stop needing. The deck faced forward and down, a wide curved viewport that gave a clear sight line across the construction zone where the fleet was positioned in the loose formation they used during non-operational periods. The ships were not visible. That was the thing that never fully lost its quality regardless of how many times he experienced it. He knew where every ship was. He had the positional data on his personal display and he had spent 21 years working on the vessels themselves and he knew their dimensions and their hull configurations and the specific way each class of ship sat in space when its drives were at minimal output. He knew all of this and he looked at the viewport and he saw nothing. Empty space. Background stars. The quiet dark of a region that the galaxy had collectively decided was not worth looking at. 240 warships, and his instruments were the only way to confirm they were there. The dark matter integration had come from a research program that humanity had been running quietly for 3 decades before Ray joined the project, started by a team of physicists who had been working on the anomalous boundary condition data that Ray had later inherited and extended. The theoretical framework had taken 12 years to develop to the point where it suggested practical application was possible. The engineering to translate that framework into actual functioning systems had taken another 18 years and had failed in interesting ways approximately 400 times before it succeeded in the way that it had finally succeeded, which was completely and at a scale that surprised even the people who had been building toward it. The Council's scientists had 2 centuries of published work on dark matter integration theory. Conferences, peer-reviewed papers, collaborative research initiatives between multiple species, the full apparatus of serious galactic scientific engagement applied to a problem that the consensus view held was probably solvable within 3 to 5 centuries given sufficient continued investment. Humanity had not published anything. Not one paper. Not one conference presentation. Not one collaborative inquiry responded to. The researchers who had done the foundational work had done it within a classification framework that kept every result inside human channels only, which had required a degree of institutional discipline that was genuinely difficult to maintain across decades of work involving hundreds of people. It had been maintained. Not perfectly, there had been 3 security incidents over 30 years that had required careful management, but well enough that nothing meaningful had reached the outside. The Council's file on human scientific activity described a moderately capable species with competent but unexceptional research output across standard fields. Nothing that suggested priority monitoring. Nothing that suggested the file required updating. Ray had read the file 8 years ago when an intelligence contact had obtained a copy and passed it through channels that were discreet enough to be worth using. He had read it in his office after the end of a 14-hour shift and he had sat with it for a while after finishing it. Small ships. Mineral trade. Not relevant. He had thought about the 211 ships that had been fully operational at that point, sitting invisible in the space outside his viewport, and he had experienced a feeling that was not quite amusement and not quite satisfaction but contained elements of both. The feeling of someone who has been doing serious work for a long time in a direction that nobody is watching and who has just received confirmation that the nobody watching part is still fully intact. He had filed the intelligence report in his personal records and gone back to work. The 240th ship had been completed 19 months ago, which brought the fleet to the number that the Project Leadership Board had determined 30 years ago was the minimum necessary for the fleet's intended operational purposes. The operational testing phase had run for 14 months. Every system on every vessel had been tested to full capacity in conditions that simulated the range of environments the fleet might be required to operate in. Everything worked. Ray had written a 2-sentence summary report to the board when testing concluded. Both sentences were factual and neither of them contained anything that could be described as emotional, because Ray's professional communication style did not include emotional content and never had. But he had stood on this observation deck for a long time after sending it. The communications officer who interrupted his morning was a young officer named Dale who had been on the flagship for 8 months and who had developed the useful habit of delivering messages in person when their content was above a certain significance threshold rather than sending them through the standard notification system. Sir. Message from Deputy Envoy Holt. Dale held the tablet at the correct angle for Ray to read without reaching for it. The Council has called a territorial session. 6 days from now. Agenda involves human territorial allocation. Ray looked at the message. Does she need the fleet active? She says stand by. She'll confirm closer to the date. Ray handed the tablet back and looked out at the empty space where 240 ships were waiting with the patient stillness of things that had been built for a purpose and had not yet been asked to fulfill it. He thought about the territorial session. About the council chamber and the 9 elevated platforms and the single flat desk at the far end where Claire Holt had been sitting for 4 years without a vote, writing in her notebook, waiting for the right moment with the same patience that the fleet had been waiting out here. He thought about Grath's 11 words. We've been standing by for 30 years, he said. A few more days is fine. Dale nodded and left him to his viewport. Outside, 240 ships that did not exist held their positions in the dark and waited. The notice arrived on a Tuesday morning and Claire read it at her desk with the particular stillness of someone who has been expecting a thing for a long time and is now watching it arrive exactly as anticipated. 48 hours. The council charter required a minimum of 10 days' notice for sessions involving territorial adjustments to member species allocations. 10 days was the standard. It existed because the council's own founding documents recognized that territorial matters required adequate preparation time for affected parties, that decisions made without sufficient notice were decisions made without sufficient input, and that an institution governing a significant portion of the known galaxy had an obligation to its own procedural standards. 48 hours was not 10 days. It was not a clerical error. Claire knew this the same way she knew most things about the council's internal operations, which was through 4 years of careful attention to patterns that repeated themselves when powerful institutions wanted outcomes they were not comfortable achieving through fully transparent processes. The short notice was a tool. It reduced preparation time for the affected party, created a compressed timeline that made formal challenges difficult to file and have processed before the session date, and allowed the council to proceed with its agenda while maintaining the technical form of having notified the relevant member. She filed a formal objection through the standard channel, drafted in precise language that cited the specific charter provision and the specific violation, and sent it with a timestamp that she kept for her own records. The objection would be received, logged, and not acknowledged in any substantive way before the session. She knew this. She filed it anyway because the record mattered and because she had learned in 4 years that the records accumulated into something even when individual entries appeared to disappear into institutional silence. Then she booked her transit. The journey to council headquarters took 31 hours at standard faster than light travel, which gave her time to review her notes, confirm the arrangements she had been quietly making for the past 6 days, and sleep for 7 hours in a way she had trained herself to do before significant professional events regardless of what her nervous system might prefer to be doing instead. She arrived at headquarters with 4 hours to spare before the session. She used 2 of them walking the public areas of the complex, which was something she did before every session she attended, a habit she had developed in her first month on the posting. The headquarters complex was large and architecturally significant and functioned as a kind of ambient communication about the council's self-understanding, what it valued, how it wanted to be perceived by the species that moved through it. She had found in 4 years that walking it slowly told her things about the institution's current mood and priorities that the official session agendas did not always reflect directly. Today the complex felt normal. Busy in the ways it was always busy, the movement of staff and representatives and administrative personnel going about the ordinary management of a galaxy-spanning institution. Nothing in the atmosphere suggested that anyone outside the 9 main council members and their immediate staffs knew what was on today's agenda or what the intended outcome was. That was also as expected. She took her seat at the far end of the chamber with 15 minutes before the session was called to order. She placed her notebook on the desk. She placed her personal device beside it, a slim unit that looked like standard communications equipment and that contained several functions that were not standard, and she placed it with the careful casual manner of someone setting down an object that is not particularly significant. Then she sat and waited for the session to begin. The 9 council members moved through the early agenda items at a pace that told her the territorial matter had been scheduled toward the end deliberately. This was another pattern she recognized. Significant items placed late in sessions ran against the natural tendency of deliberative bodies to give more energy and attention to early items, and members who had been sitting for 2 hours on routine business when a complex item arrived were members whose scrutiny was slightly less sharp than it might otherwise have been. It was a subtle effect and probably unconscious in its application, but it was real and she had observed it consistently enough to consider it reliable. She listened to the early items with full attention and wrote in her notebook periodically in a way that looked like routine session notes and was considerably more than that. When the territorial item was introduced, she watched the chamber carefully. The framing was smooth. Administrative efficiency was the first reason given, followed by resource optimization, followed by a brief reference to updated survey data suggesting that the relevant sectors contained less economically viable material than previous assessments had indicated. The three reasons were presented in a sequence that built from the technical to the quantitative, the kind of progression that gave a decision the appearance of being driven by evidence rather than interest. Claire knew the survey data. She had read it 6 weeks ago through channels that the Council's internal communications team did not know she had access to. The survey data showed nothing that justified a 60% territorial reduction. It showed modest adjustments in resource projections in two sectors that might have supported a 10 to 15% reduction in those specific areas if the Council had wanted to make a conservative case for it. 60% was not derived from the survey data. 60% was derived from 3 separate private communications between Council members over the past 4 months in which the territorial reduction had been discussed as a mechanism for opening space that 2 Council members wanted access to for their own extraction operations. The communications were candid in ways that communications between powerful people are candid when they believe they are private, which meant they were considerably more informative about the actual motivations involved than any official record would ever be. Claire had read all 3 of them. She had read them with the same careful neutral attention she brought to everything, and she had made her notes, and she had begun making the arrangements that she had completed yesterday afternoon, and she had come to this session today with her notebook and her device and 4 years of collected understanding of exactly how this institution operated when it thought nobody who mattered was watching. When the floor opened for Class 3 statements, she stood up. The chamber's attention shifted to her end in the way attention shifts when something unexpected interrupts an expected pattern. 9 species at the main table, their staff in the gallery behind them, the various administrative personnel at their stations around the perimeter. All of them looking at the human representative who had stood up at the far end of the room, which was not in itself unusual since Class 3 statements were a standard procedural item, but which carried a quality today that was slightly different from the quality her previous statements had carried. She looked comfortable. Not nervously composed in the way that representatives from smaller species sometimes looked when addressing the full chamber. Not performing confidence to compensate for its absence. Actually comfortable, the way you are comfortable in a situation that you have prepared for thoroughly and that is now proceeding along lines you anticipated. She spoke for 4 minutes. She did not argue against the territorial reduction. She did not cite the 48-hour notice violation, though she held the filed objection in her records and its timestamp was precise and she would use it when the time was appropriate, and this was not yet that time. She did not reference the charter provisions that a non-voting member could invoke to request extended deliberation, which would have been granted as a formality and then proceeded to the same outcome on a slightly longer timeline. She told the Council she had something to show them. She picked up her device from the desk and connected it to the chamber's central display system through the standard Class 3 member interface, which gave non-voting representatives read-only display access for the purpose of supporting their formal statements. The connection completed in 2 seconds. Every screen in the chamber filled simultaneously with a data feed. The Council members looked at it with the expression of people encountering something they had not been told to expect. Numbers scrolled across the displays. Spatial coordinates. Sensor readings from a specific region of space 3,000 light-years from the chamber. Live data, time-stamped in real time, pulled directly from the Council's own long-range sensor network through an access point that she had been using for considerably longer than anyone in the room was aware. The Council members read the coordinates and the readings, and then they looked at the region itself on the display. Empty space. A completely normal region of space showing background radiation at standard levels, no mass concentrations above the negligible, no energy signatures of any kind, no indication that anything other than the ordinary physics of an unremarkable piece of the galaxy was present there. The Council's own sensors confirming the Council's own data showing a completely empty region of space 3,000 light-years away. Some of them looked mildly curious. Some looked mildly confused. 1 or 2 were already preparing the expressions of people who were going to note politely that a Class 3 member had used their statement time to display an empty region of space and that they were not certain of the relevance. Claire let them look for a moment. "That is a live feed from your own sensor network," she said. "The data is accurate. Your instruments are functioning correctly." She paused for exactly long enough. "That region of space reads as completely empty." Another pause. Shorter. "It is not empty." The chamber was quiet. Not the polite, attentive quiet of a deliberative body waiting for a speaker to reach their point. Something different. Something that happened in the space between her last two sentences where the 9 most powerful species in the known galaxy sat with the specific discomfort of people who have just been told that something they can see with their own instruments is not what their instruments say it is, and who are beginning to understand that the person telling them this is not making an error. Claire stood at the far end of the chamber and waited for the question that was now inevitable. She had been waiting 4 years for this particular moment. She was in no hurry. 60 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In a council chamber where 9 species had just been told that a region of space their own instruments confirmed was empty was in fact not empty, 60 seconds had a different quality. Claire had learned this through observation over 4 years, the specific way that intelligent beings processed unexpected information, the stages that moved from initial confusion through attempted reframing through the particular focused stillness that preceded genuine understanding. The stages were consistent across species in ways that suggested something fundamental about how minds worked when reality delivered something their existing framework had not accounted for. She had timed it carefully across dozens of observations. 60 seconds was reliable. She stood at the far end of the chamber and watched the 9 platforms with the calm attention of someone who had done their preparation and was now simply present for what came next. She watched the initial expressions, the slight forward lean of members trying to read the data more carefully, the brief exchanges between representatives and their nearby staff, the moment when several members reached for their personal terminals to run independent verification of what the chamber screens were showing. The verification would return the same result. She had confirmed this was the case before entering the chamber. The feed was clean, the data was accurate, the council's own sensor network was showing exactly what it was showing, which was a completely empty region of space 3,000 light-years away that was completely empty in every measurable sense that their technology could assess. At 58 seconds she opened the channel. The connection was direct, encrypted, running through a communications architecture that she had spent 14 months building into the council headquarters infrastructure through access points that the council's technical staff had not identified as anything other than standard equipment maintenance. The channel opened cleanly with no lag and no interference. "Ray," she said. "Show them." 3,000 light-years away Ray Garrett was standing at the center of the flagship's command deck rather than the observation deck, which was where he had moved 2 hours ago when Claire's message confirmed the session was proceeding as anticipated and that she would be opening the channel at the 60-second mark following her statement. He had spent the 2 hours doing what he always did before significant operational moments, which was walking the ship. Not inspecting exactly, though inspection was part of it. More the activity of someone who had built a thing over a long time and wanted to be in contact with it before it was asked to do what it had been built for. He knew every section of the flagship. He knew the engineering teams by name and the specific work each of them had contributed to the vessel's construction and systems. He had spent 21 years in the spaces that made up this ship, and the relationship he had with it was not something he would have described in those terms to anyone, but it was real in the way that long-working relationships with significant projects become real. He was at the command deck when the channel opened. He heard Claire's voice, 2 words, and he turned to his fleet communications officer, a steady, experienced officer named Pete who had been on the project for 9 years and who understood what the moment required without needing it explained. Ray gave a single nod. Pete entered the command. The council chamber screens changed. There was no transition. No visual effect that gave the eye a moment to prepare. The empty region of space that had been on every screen in the chamber was simply replaced, in an instant that had no duration, by the same region of space containing 240 warships. The silence that followed was of a kind that the chamber had genuinely never produced before. Claire had been in that chamber for 4 years. She had sat through hundreds of hours of sessions covering everything from major territorial disputes to routine administrative items, and she had developed a thorough understanding of the chamber's acoustic and atmospheric qualities across a full range of situations. She knew what it sounded like when it was busy and when it was quiet and when it was performing the particular kind of careful, deliberate silence that governing bodies used when they wanted to signal that a matter was being taken seriously. This was none of those things. This was the silence of 9 species encountering something simultaneously that none of them had any prepared response to, the complete suspension of the normal ongoing activity of a room full of beings managing a complex institution, replaced by the simple undivided fact of 240 warships on every screen. The ships were dark. Not the darkness of powered-down systems or damage or age. A deliberate deep darkness that was partly their hull design and partly the dark matter drive still running at low output, still maintaining the partial invisibility that meant the sensor arrays could see them now but could not fully resolve them, registering their presence clearly while something in the nature of how they existed in space refused to be completely captured by the instruments trying to measure them. They were large. The scale reference points on the sensor display made the size clear, and the size was not a size that fit comfortably into the Council's existing categories for what a fleet was supposed to look like. The Council maintained detailed records of every military fleet operated by every member species and every known non-member species within their sensor range. Those records had ranges, size classifications, capability assessments built from decades of observation and analysis. The human fleet on the screen did not fit inside those ranges. It sat above them in a way that required the display scale to adjust automatically to accommodate what it was showing. Grath had not moved since the screens changed. He was a being who had spent 30 years in Council intelligence developing and maintaining a comprehensive picture of the military and strategic landscape of known space. That picture was his professional identity in a fundamental sense, the thing he had built his career on and his reputation on, and his sense of himself as the most informed person in any room he entered. He looked at the screens and felt something happening to that picture that he could not immediately process because the processing required accepting a premise that his 30 years of work had given him no reason to consider. He had said 11 words 4 hours ago. He was currently looking at a fleet that made those 11 words not just wrong but wrong in a direction and at a scale that his mind was still working to fully measure. Ray's voice came through the open channel and the chamber heard it in 11 simultaneous translations, each one perfectly rendered, each one carrying the same quality as the original, which was the calm of someone for whom this moment was the arrival of something expected rather than the surprise of something unprecedented. Good afternoon. 2 words. Unhurried. The greeting of someone who had somewhere to be and was not rushing to get there. This fleet has been operational for 2 years. Our crews are trained and our systems are fully tested. A pause that was brief and clean and not theatrical. This is not our only fleet. The silence in the chamber did not deepen so much as it changed quality. The first silence had been the silence of surprise. This was different. This was the silence of people updating their understanding of their situation in real time and arriving at new positions that they had not occupied before and that required a moment to settle into. A second fleet. The words sat in the chamber with a particular weight of information that changed the meaning of everything around it. 240 ships that had been invisible to every sensor array in Council space for an unknown period of time, and that was not the complete picture. That was one fleet. The complete picture was larger than what they were looking at and they did not know by how much. Deputy Envoy Holt will now tell you what comes next, Ray said. I'd suggest listening carefully. The channel closed. The chamber was still. Claire looked around it slowly. 9 platforms, 9 species, the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, and every member of it was looking at her end of the chamber with an attention so complete and so focused that it had a physical quality. Not threatening. Simply total. The kind of attention that gets paid to the most important thing in a room when everything else has stopped mattering by comparison. For 4 years she had sat at the far end of this chamber with a small desk and a notebook and no vote. She let the moment exist for exactly as long as it needed to. Then she looked at the 9 platforms with the steady, unhurried calm of someone who has been preparing for a conversation for a very long time and is now simply ready to have it. The territorial vote, she said, will not be necessary. Nobody disagreed. Nobody spoke at all. The screens around the chamber showed 240 warships holding position 3,000 light-years away, dark and patient and partially invisible, and the number behind them that Ray had placed into the room with 8 words was still sitting in the air of the chamber like a question that the Council's combined intelligence apparatus was going to spend a significant amount of time trying to answer. Claire reached for her notebook. She opened it to the page with the 2 words she had written 4 hours ago when Grath had dismissed humanity in 11 words without looking up from his records. She read what she had written. Then she closed the notebook again and waited for the Council to find its voice. The Council member who was supposed to call the vote was a senior Felian representative named Coordinator Voss, 26 years on the Council, known for his procedural precision and his ability to move agenda items through deliberation efficiently. He had called hundreds of votes in his tenure. He knew the language and the timing and the exact manner of introducing a motion that signaled to the chamber that the deliberation phase was complete and the decision phase was beginning. He did not call the vote. He sat at his platform and looked at his screens and said nothing, and nobody asked him why, because the answer was on every screen in the chamber and had been for the past 11 minutes and was not becoming less relevant with time. 240 warships. Holding position. Patient in the way that things are patient when patience is not an effort but simply a state, when waiting is not a cost being paid but simply the condition of a thing that has been ready for a long time and is prepared to remain ready for whatever additional time the situation requires. The chamber had been in this condition for 11 minutes. Not paralyzed, not in crisis, not the kind of institutional dysfunction that happened when a governing body lost its capacity to function. Simply recalibrating, each member at their own pace, in the way that intelligent beings recalibrate when the information available to them has changed significantly and the frameworks they have been using to make sense of that information need to be updated before those frameworks can be reliably applied again. Claire stood at the far end of the chamber and waited. She had not moved since her last sentence. She had not reached for her notebook or her device or done any of the small physical things that people do when they are waiting and would prefer to be doing something else. She was simply standing at her desk with the settled quality of someone who had arrived at a destination and was in no particular hurry to leave it. When she judged that the recalibration had progressed to the point where the chamber was ready to receive information rather than simply process what it had already received, she sat down. And she began to talk. The 4 hours that followed were not recorded in the standard session transcript in the way that normal council proceedings were recorded. The official record noted simply that an extended discussion took place following a presentation by Earth's Class 3 representative regarding revised membership terms, and that the session concluded without a vote on the originally scheduled territorial item. Future diplomatic historians would spend considerable energy trying to reconstruct what actually happened in those 4 hours from the secondary accounts and the personal records of people who were present and the careful analysis of what changed between the start of the session and its end. They would conclude, generally, that the session represented the most consequential 4 hours in council history since the institution's founding, and that the human representative who conducted the discussion had done so with a strategic clarity and a disciplined restraint that the historical record had rarely seen combined in a single person at a single moment. What the record could not fully capture was the texture of it. The way Claire moved through the proposal without any of the performance that council discussions usually contained, the positioning and the rhetorical management and the careful calibration of tone that experienced council members used to shape how their words were received. She did none of that. She presented facts, she outlined terms, she answered questions with the directness of someone who had prepared thoroughly and had no investment in the answers being received in any particular way other than accurately. The proposal itself was not aggressive. Full voting rights and a seat at the main table were things that humanity's actual status in the galaxy now plainly justified, and she said so without apology and without elaboration, in the same tone she might have used to note that a classification error in an administrative record had been identified and needed correction. The territorial allocation proposal was based on a detailed survey of human actual presence and activity in the relevant sectors, a survey that her office had conducted over the previous 3 years and that was considerably more current and considerably more thorough than the Council's own data on the subject. She had copies of the Council's internal communications about the territorial session. She did not mention this directly, but she answered 2 questions from Council members with information that could only have come from those communications, and she watched the understanding settle across the chamber that she was aware of more than she was stating and that the gap between what she knew and what she was choosing to deploy in this room was a gap that existed because she had chosen restraint rather than because she lacked material. This was its own kind of information and the council members received it accordingly. 3 members asked substantive questions about the membership proposal terms. She answered each one fully and without deflection. 2 members made statements that were framed as questions but were actually expressions of institutional discomfort about the process, about the manner in which the situation had arrived, about what it meant for the Council's understanding of its own information picture. She acknowledged the discomfort directly and without dismissing it and said that Earth's government considered a more accurate and more honest relationship between humanity and the Council to be in the interest of both parties, and that the proposal on the table was offered in that spirit. She did not reference the fleet again. Not once. It remained on the screens throughout the 4 hours, present and visible, but she treated it as background information that the chamber could factor into its own thinking rather than as a lever she was applying to produce a specific response. The effect of this was more significant than direct leverage would have been, because direct leverage produced resistance and resentment and the kind of agreement that looked for the first available opportunity to be revisited, and what she was building was not that kind of agreement. At the end of the 4 hours she gave them 1 week to respond formally to the proposal, and she said it in a way that made clear the week was a courtesy extended in good faith rather than a deadline backed by implicit threat, and that Earth's government was genuinely prepared to engage with a formal response whatever it contained. Then she picked up her notebook and her device and stood up. She had been in the chamber for 6 hours and 14 minutes. She had sat in this room for 4 years in a seat at the far end with no vote and a small desk and a notebook that nobody had looked at carefully enough to wonder about. She gathered her things with the same unhurried manner she had brought to everything today, and she was almost to the door when she heard Grath's voice behind her. She stopped. She had been expecting the question. Not with certainty, because Grath was intelligent enough that she had considered several possible responses he might offer at the end of this session, but the question he asked was the one she had assessed as most likely from a being whose professional identity was built on knowing things and who had spent 4 hours absorbing the specific quality of not having known something that he should have known. "How long have you known about the territorial session agenda?" She turned. The chamber was still. The screen still showed the fleet. Grath was looking at her from his platform with the controlled expression of a professional managing a significant internal revision and doing it with the dignity that 30 years of consequential work entitled him to. She looked back at him across the length of the room. The full length of the chamber, from the main table to the far end where the small flat desk sat, a distance she had walked hundreds of times in 4 years, a distance that had always felt like it meant something about the relationship between the seat she occupied and the seats at the other end. Earth's intelligence service has had full access to Council internal communications for 11 years, she said. She watched him receive that. The specific stillness of a man processing information that restructured a significant portion of his professional picture in a single sentence. "The file we maintain on each Council species is updated monthly." She held his gaze with the same steadiness she had held everything today. "The file your office maintains on humanity was last updated 22 years ago." The chamber was absolutely quiet. She let the quiet exist for exactly the amount of time it needed to exist, which was long enough for the full meaning of what she had said to settle into every corner of the room and be received by every being present. "You should update it," she said. Then she walked out. The door closed behind her and the chamber stayed quiet. Grath sat at his platform and looked at the screens and did the specific internal work of someone whose professional self-understanding has been significantly and permanently revised and who is choosing to do that work honestly rather than defensively, because honest revision was more useful than defensive resistance even when honest revision was considerably less comfortable. He thought about 11 words. He thought about 22 years. He thought about a human representative who had sat at the far end of this chamber for 4 years without a vote and a small desk and a notebook that he had never once looked at carefully enough to wonder what was in it, and who had spent those 4 years building something that he was only now beginning to understand the full shape of, and who had walked out of the room today with the same unhurried manner she had walked in with, as if the previous 6 hours had been simply the completion of something she had already finished planning a long time ago. He pulled up the humanity file on his terminal. Last updated 22 years ago. The date sat in the header of the document with the specific quality of a detail that had been unremarkable for a long time and was now the most significant thing on his screen. He opened a new update entry. The blank space looked back at him. He thought about 240 ships. He thought about dark matter integration that his scientists had placed 3 to 5 centuries away. He thought about 11 years of undetected access to Council internal communications. He thought about the second fleet that Ray Garrett had mentioned in 8 words and that represented an unknown quantity that his office was going to need to assess from a starting position of knowing almost nothing. He thought about the question of how you wrote a threat assessment for a species that had been sitting in your chamber for 4 years learning everything about you while you learned nothing about them. He was going to need more than 11 words. He started typing. Outside the chamber in the corridor, Claire Holt walked at her normal pace toward the transit section. She did not look back. She had her notebook under her arm and her device in her bag and the formal proposal on record with a 1-week response window, and she had 4 years of session transcripts and 11 years of intelligence material and a very clear picture of exactly how the Council was going to spend the next 7 days. She had a transit to book. And a message to send to Ray Garrett, who had been standing by for 30 years and who deserved to know that the standing by was over.